vital training and landmark security guarantees. Going forward, we must not only sustain, but continue to step up our support, so that when the time comes, Ukraine can sit at the negotiating table in a position of strength and pursue a good deal for lasting peace. Our world is increasingly more dangerous. We must be better equipped to meet any threat across all domains, both now and in the future. Russian destabilization campaigns in allied countries are on the rise. They have targeted digital infrastructure, British officials and even your National Health Service. Just last month, once again, you detected a Russian spy ship in British waters. And you made it clear to Moscow that such brazen acts were simply unacceptable. To stop these attacks once and for all, we need to up our game and make sure our deterrence leaves no room for doubt. We can do this by investing even more in defense. To put it in another way, to prevent war, we must spend more. The UK understands this instinctively. You have long met the 2% target, and I welcome plans to further increase investments in defense. Because in a more dangerous world, 2% will not be enough to keep us safe. We need to invest considerably more. We also need to replenish our stocks, and fast. There's no time to waste. Reviving our defense industries to ramp up defense production is an absolute must. During World War II, factories in the UK and the US produced billions of rounds of ammunition. That was before digitization and automation. With all the might of British manufacturing, just imagine what we could achieve now. The challenges we face are complex, but together in NATO, there's nothing we cannot do. So thank you for your continued leadership and support of our transatlantic alliance. Prime Minister, dear Keir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's very good to be here. I should say it's very good to be back here. And as you know, the UK's commitment to NATO is stronger than ever because the need for NATO is stronger than ever. And we've had a very good and productive discussion today on how we can meet the rising threats that Russia poses across our continent, including the situation, of course, in Ukraine. Now, a couple of weeks ago, as you know, I was in Kyiv. I saw residential buildings destroyed just days before. I met soldiers in the ICU recovering from really terrible burns. And I met children whose parents are out there now on the front line. And it's yet another reminder that this is a war not just in Ukraine, but a war on Ukraine against those children and their futures. And that's why together we stand with them. We are all working to end this war. But let's be absolutely clear. Peace will come through strength. And we must do all that we can to support Ukraine's defence. And that means stabilising the front line, providing the kit and training that they need. And that's why this year the UK will give more military support to Ukraine than ever before. We need to see all allies stepping up, particularly in Europe. President Trump has threatened more sanctions on Russia, and it's clear that that's got Putin rattled. We know that he's worried about the state of the Russian economy. So I'm here to work with our European partners on keeping up the pressure, targeting the energy revenues and the companies supplying his missile factories to crush Putin's war machine. Because ultimately, alongside our military support, that is what will bring peace closer. And we must keep working together to bolster NATO. And as you say, things that would have provoked utter outrage just a few years ago have now become almost commonplace. Russian spy ships loitering off the British coast, a campaign of sabotage across Europe, cyber attacks, election interference, and attempted assassination. Russia is seeking to destabilize our continent and target our values. So we should still be outraged, and we must harden European defence. In the UK, we're proud to be a leading NATO ally, part of the forward land forces, helping to police our skies and patrol our seas. Our defence spending is, of course, 2.3% of GDP now, and we're working hard to set the path to 2.5. And NATO's plans and requirements, as well as the principle of NATO first, will be at the heart of our strategic defence review this year. Across Europe, we must shoulder more of the burden now, because it's our burden to carry. Now, that's what I'll be discussing at the EU Council this evening. We want to deliver an ambitious UK-EU security partnership to bolster NATO, covering military technology and R&D, improving the mobility of forces across Europe, protecting our critical infrastructure, and deepening our industrial collaboration to increase defence production. We can't be commentators when it comes to matters of peace on our continent. We must lead, and that's what I'm determined that we will do. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, we now have time for a few questions. Third row, Sky.
Thanks very much. Beth Rigby, Sky News. Secretary General, NATO has stood united against Russia with all allies in lockstep since the invasion in 2022. Now 2 members, Canada and US, are on the cusp of a trade war. Do you fear the alliance is unravelling at the most fragile of times? And Prime Minister, President Trump says tariffs on the EU are coming. He hasn't ruled out tariffs on the UK. Are you worried about that? And be it from forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table to threatening trade wars with allies, isn't it the truth that President Trump is a bad thing for Europe's economic prosperity and security? Thank you very much.
On your first question, let me say that I'm absolutely convinced we can deal with these issues, and there are always issues between allies. It is never always tranquil and happy-going. There are always issues, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. But I'm absolutely convinced that will not get in the way of our collective determination to keep our deterrence strong. And when you talk trade, it is interesting to see that the trade surplus of the US getting into Europe is since 2022. They sell more to Europe than we sell to them. And the net surplus is $180 billion since 2022. So that tells you something, that there are more figures and numbers to look at. But going back to your question, I'm absolutely convinced it will not have an impact on our collective deterrence.
Thank you very much, Beth. Look, on the question firstly of tariffs, obviously it's early days, and I think what's really important is open and strong trading relations, and that's been the basis of my discussions with President Trump. And I know that intense US-EU discussions are planned. In relation to the issue that you link it to of Ukraine, I do think it's right for us to acknowledge the role that the US have played in relation to the joint effort on Ukraine. And that's, of course, pivotal because it's not just a question of a war or the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is not just a European issue. It's a question of global security. And I think it's very important that we see it in that context. And one thing that's come out of the awful conflict in Ukraine is actually a stronger and bigger NATO, which I think is really important. And as you know, in the Labour Party, we're really proud of the fact that we're a founding member all those years ago in relation to NATO. I think NATO is as important now as it was back then, and it's really important that it's in a stronger position. I think the discussions that we've been having between us today and the discussions I'll have later on this evening are about how we take that forward and strengthen it even further, because there has to be a very strong European element to the defence that we are providing in really difficult times. Thank you.
All right, BBC, second row, please.
Oh, there it is. Thank you, Chris Mason, BBC Questions on a similar theme, if I may. Secretary General, what would you say to NATO members currently falling out with each other in public over tariffs? And what's your message to the United States and Denmark as they are feuding over territory? And Prime Minister, would you be willing to water down your reset with the European Union in order to keep President Trump on side? Thank you.
On tariffs, clearly that is not what NATO is about. Maybe I shouldn't comment too much on that, other than saying that when you look at the defense industrial base, it is clearly, it's very clear that the US is selling much more into Europe than Europe is buying from the US. And by the way, collectively, we have to produce much more. There is so much money floating around, and much more will come in because we are spending more. Last year, non-US allies spent 18% more on defense than the year before. So from 2023 to 2024, it was an 18% increase, almost 20%. So we are spending much more. That means more money available for the defense industrial base. And we have to buy it from everywhere. The US has to ramp up, Norway has to ramp up, the UK has to ramp up, the EU, including the big countries like Italy and Spain and Norway, outside the EU of course, but also of course France, and then Turkey. So all these big defense industrial based countries have to ramp up defense production, and there's so much money floating around. And again, what we see clearly is this trade surplus from the US getting into Europe. So there is much more to say to all these numbers than when you look at the, let's say, the aggregate. And on Greenland, I said before, what I think is very useful is that President Trump alerted us to the fact that when it comes to the High North, there is a geopolitical and strategic issue at stake. I would say that it's not only about Greenland. This has to do with Finland, it has to do with Sweden, Norway, Iceland, yes, Greenland, and therefore Denmark, also Canada, and also the US. And clearly, collectively, as an alliance, we will always look at the best way to make sure that we can tackle those challenges.
Look, in relation to the relationship between the UK and the US and the EU, I've always been clear that both are important to us. Now, that for me isn't new. I think that's always been the case and will be the case for many, many years to come. That's why in my discussions with President Trump, we've touched on issues of trade and on issues of security, both really important in relation to the trade that we already do between our two countries, but also the security, the defence and the intelligence partnership that we've founded over many, many years, hugely important to our collective defence. Obviously, I'm here at NATO today, making the clear case and having the discussions about defence and security, and tonight I'll be at the EU Council. Now, tonight is very much obviously about security and defence, where I do think there's a very important discussion to be had about how we increase our security and defence work together in a very volatile world. But also, I will touch on the wider reset, which goes beyond defence and security, into the fields of energy and into trade and the economy. And so, back to where I started, really, both of these relations are very important to us. We are not choosing between them, but that's historically been the position of the UK for many, many decades now.
All right, we have time for one more question. ITV.
Secretary General, these are much more than issues between allies. You have a NATO ally threatening to seize territory from another NATO ally. This is much worse than it's ever been. Isn't it now time that Europe got realistic and started planning for a future of defence that may not include the United States? And Prime Minister, if I may, I know you want to keep a foot in both camps, and I know you don't want to commit here, but you're trying to reset with Europe at exactly the time that President Trump indicates he might be trying to divide and rule in Europe. If he does, and your other European leaders ask you, whose side are you on, ours or theirs, what will you say to them?
Well, on your question about NATO and the assumption that you could run NATO without the US, that is for so many reasons a silly thought.
I wasn't assuming.
At least...
European defence without the US.
Yeah, but that means that you have European defence without the US being involved. That's what you're saying. That is a NATO or whatever the organization organization is then called without the US. For many reasons that will not work. First of all, because we are not, as the Prime Minister was saying, as Keir Starmer was saying, when you look at Ukraine, it is not just Ukraine and Russia, which would be bad enough. It is a geopolitical thing which is going on. The US realizes that, the European side of NATO realizes that, it is China, North Korea, Iran, all getting connected to Russia. So this is a geopolitical thing playing out at the moment with Ukraine. And therefore Ukraine must prevail not only for Ukraine's sake, first of all, but also because of the geopolitical impact. And for NATO as a whole, collectively, we are 20 times bigger than the Russian economy. Collectively, we are able to protect the collective NATO territory, including the US. And the US is also under threat now with the long-range, nuclear long-range missiles coming out of North Korea maybe in the future, thanks to all the technology the Russians are delivering. So for so many reasons, we have to stay connected. I'm a staunch transatlanticist. I absolutely believe that the best thing the West can do is to stay united. And I know that the same thinking is still prevalent in the US, including in the White House.
In relation to the US and the EU, or Europe more generally, if you look at our vital interests, it's really important that we don't, that we work with both and we don't see it as an either-or. On defence and security, we are working very closely with our European allies every day, particularly in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, but equally on defence and security with the US and the special relationship in relation to defence, security and, of course, the intelligence capability that we have developed together. This is vitally important and it is in the best interests of the UK, but also the best interests, I think, in terms of global security and defence, that we continue to work both with the US and with Europe on these vital issues. When it comes to trade equally, we've got a huge amount of trade between the US and the UK, as we have with the EU, and that's why it's important that I always act in the national interest, the best interests of the UK, as we stay resolute saying that it's important that we work with both sets of partners, particularly this volatile time, where I think it's generally accepted and rightly accepted that we face a more volatile world now than we have done for many decades. So now is the time to step up on all fronts with both the US and the EU. It is not the time to pull back on either front. Thank you very much.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Of course not.
Was your voice coach definitely